Let's talk about the actual experience of prophecy. As we mentioned previously, prophecy happened through the conduit of dreams or visions. Now, that doesn't mean that every dream or every vision is actual prophecy. It just means that God chose that vehicle to bring prophecy about. If a person is having a very vivid dream, it doesn't necessarily mean prophecy. And dreams are actually a fascinating topic that maybe one day I'll get into on this channel, but it's totally off course, so we're not going to go there right now. Visions also could just be somebody hallucinating. It could be a medication. It could be a food that somebody ate. It could be heat stroke. So we can't necessarily say that a vision is prophecy. Very important point. Now, when a prophet entered a dreamlike state in order to receive a prophecy, it would be a very overwhelming experience for his body, and his body would tremble, because at that point in time, he would lose control of all of his body, and he would even lose control of his active mind. Only the imaginative part of his mind would be functioning, and it was through that God would send visions and metaphorical imagery that would form the prophecy that the prophet would receive, and upon awakening, he would be able to put his own words into explaining what those visions meant according to the understanding that was given to him by God. Some of the verses that allude to this incredibly overwhelming state of prophecy are those found in Genesis chapter 15, verse 12, which speaks of Abraham, that speaks of a great dark dread that fell over him. In the book of Daniel, it similarly says, "My appearance was horribly changed, and I retained no strength." That's in Daniel chapter 10, verse 8. When the children of Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they were elevated to the level of prophecy, and they experienced this extremely overwhelming physical experience. And though they were very happy to have had it, because up until that point, it was possible to have doubted the prophetic experience of somebody else. But once the children of Israel actually experienced it for themselves, they said, hey, now we know that God can speak to man and that man can live. But Moses, please continue hearing prophecy on our behalf. It's just too intense for us. You can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 20 and 22. I'll read it to you. "And it was when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, and the mountain was burning with fire, that you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. And you said, Behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness. And we heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks to man, yet man remains alive. And so now should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, we will die." So the children of Israel told Moses, they said, this experience is just too intense and too powerful for us. So we want you to be our messenger. We want you to receive the prophecies directly from God and give it over to us. Because Moses, he had a different sort of prophecy, which we'll get into in a different video. But Moses did not have the incredibly intense experience that the other prophets had. So we'll speak about that at a later time. Being in a prophetic state wasn't necessarily a time-consuming thing. A person could go in and out of a state of prophecy very quickly. It could be like a flash of lightning in which they would have that image that they automatically understood what it meant. And even though it happened very quickly, a prophet retained the vision and he had clarity of understanding, and he was able to formulate the words to explain that prophecy to the person or the nation or whatever he was supposed to give it over to. There's a very big misconception that a prophet is required to either predict future events or to perform miracles. And the truth is, neither of those are requirements of prophecy. Prophecy is actually about a deeper connection with God, about experiencing godliness on a very personal, very intense level. It's about a oneness with God. When a prophet attains that level, they have this deep connection with God. What happens is that their soul can rise above the typical level of themselves, and they actually can access information that wouldn't be available to them otherwise. Just like it says in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 6, "The Spirit of God will descend upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and you will be transformed into a different person." A prophet became a different person through this access of information, this knowledge that he was allowed to access by simply rising above his typical realm of understanding. Throughout history, there were many, many, many prophets. And it's true that we only know a handful of them. But there were prophets who received prophecy solely for themselves. There were prophets who received prophecy on behalf of other people. And there were prophets who received prophecy on behalf of entire nations, like Jonah. But prophets were a common part of life once upon a time. We can even see this illustrated in the first book of Samuel, chapter 9, where Saul consults a prophet in order to find his father's donkeys. You see, people had a common relationship with prophets of their generation. prophets of their geographical location. They would consult prophets for things that we consider completely mundane these days. It was just a normal part of life. And these prophecies are not recorded in the Torah necessarily because many of these prophecies were just individual prophecies. They weren't things that had timeless messages for future generations. All of the prophecies that are recorded in the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, those are prophecies that were determined to be timeless and to carry messages that people could learn from throughout history. Now, prophecy is an incredibly powerful force, and I'm sure you notice that there's not many prophets, at least true prophets, walking around these days. That's because in the early Second Temple period, there was a group called the Men of the Great Assembly, which included prophets such as Malachi, Zechariah, and Haggai, and other prophets of the Bible themselves. They realized that we were standing on the cusp of a very dark era in which the Jewish people would be dispersed and exiled from the land of Israel, and we would be sent all over to surrounding nations, and we would just really be split up all over the world. Because of this realization, those prophets and the men of the Great Assembly took upon themselves to do multiple things. One of the things that they did was to seal the Hebrew Bible. They compiled the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible that contained timeless messages for people in all ages. This was extremely important because after they sealed the Bible, there's no other book that the Jewish people ever accept being added to it. Another thing related to prophecy that the men of the Great Assembly did was actually to address the fact that, unfortunately, the Jewish people at that time had, many of them, fallen into idol-worshiping ways. So the men of the Great Assembly, they prayed to God and they asked God, please take away this desire for idol worship. At that point in time, people were very intensely spiritual and they wanted to serve something. So some people chose to serve God and some people chose to serve idols, but everybody wanted to serve something. So when the men of the Great Assembly prayed that this desire for worshiping idols should be taken away, God, he said, but in order for me to take away this nature of wanting to serve idols, he said, I'm going to have to take away prophets as well. Why? Because prophecy gave a person that incredible connection to God. And if a person wanted to connect with something and they had this easily accessible prophet, but they didn't have idolatry, they didn't have that option, then the balance of free choice would be skewed. And God wants us to have free choice. So we need to have the ability to serve an idol, and we need to have the ability to serve God. And prophecy pushed us towards serving God, whereas the desire for idol worship pushed us towards serving idols. So if God was going to take away one, he had to take away the other. So during the Second Temple period, both the desire to worship idols and prophecy were taken away in large from the world. Even today, there are people who worship idols, but it's not with the same intensity and fervor as it was once upon a time. And there are people who have some prophetic insight, but it's not as well known and it's not easy to find these people. And I would say that also a lot of people are more skeptical these days. So even if there are some people who have more of a prophetic insight, we don't necessarily have the drive to connect with those people. So in other words, this balance was evened out by losing out on the incredible aspect of prophecy and the incredible drive towards idolatry. All right, up next, we're going to talk about who can actually be a prophet. We'll get into the specifics in the next video.